Good evening, everyone. It's Nancy Miller with some important information about this episode. I don't usually do two-parters if I can avoid it, but as I was halfway through recording this episode, I came down with a pretty bad cold, so it hurts for me to talk, and it's not that pleasant of a listen. But I was determined to put out a new episode this week, and I realized what I've recorded so far was a pretty decent halfway point. So I thought I'd do something different. I'm releasing what you might call part 1 today. Then I will drop the complete episode, the second half of the story, early this coming week when I feel a little better. So please don't write me angry emails about how this ended really abruptly and where is part 2. I'm telling you, this is one half of what's going to be a full episode that will come out likely March 18th. And then I'm going to archive this little halvesy and just release the full episode. So again, consider this a preview or part 1, whatever the case. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be back soon when I don't sound like Butters from South Park. Thank you so much for listening as always, and I'll see you soon. Guilty or not guilty? In the rule of law, that determination, guilty or not guilty, well, it's made by a jury of one's peers. In the realm of true crime, the musings over whether or not someone is innocent or guilty, that begins much earlier. An impression, often formed within seconds of the actual tragic event. When someone dials 3 little numbers and they're asked the essential question, 911, what is your emergency? Since its formal introduction in 1968, the 911 emergency dispatch system, it saved countless lives and sussed out more than a few suspects. Because the 911 call has evolved from an efficient way of reporting a crime into a possible clue, a piece of evidence in and of itself. After all, who hasn't heard a snippet of a 911 call on some true crime show and wondered, does the person on the other end of that line sound innocent or guilty? Do they sound emotionless, detached, or more over the top and hysterical? Did they blurt out too many details, or perhaps hold back with too few? These phone calls, they offered impressions, nothing more. Just a subjective opinion, not hard evidence. That is until one day, word came from the FBI about a method of 911 call analysis that could transform subjective opinion into legitimate science. A way to quantify a person's choice of words. Did they say bleed or bloody? Verb or adjective? A way to scrutinize someone's pitch, their cadence, their tone, to determine whether or not they were innocent
or guilty. Possibly solving a murder case
with information offered before the ambulance even arrived.
The potential for this bold new era of behavioral science. It was profound. And in tonight's episode, we'll hear how that science is put to the test. In a murder case where detectives will need to determine, is the voice on the other end of that 911 call that of a sweet, innocent witness, or the sound of a secretly scheming killer? You'll hear all about it and much more in this episode of Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller. Thank you so much for joining me. Dead Sleep is, as always, independent and ad-free. It's listeners who make this show happen. So if you would like to be part of our little, strange niche community of people who like to unwind to a bit of true crime, you can subscribe and enjoy a bonus episode each month. Subscribe via Patreon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. More on that in the show notes. Now, a quick note about tonight's story. It's a notorious case, one that goes back about a decade, but remains controversial all these years later. It's a murder case that is considered solved, case closed. But for many, the case remains unresolved, especially for the lead detective, who wonders, to this day, if justice was really served. Did they put the right person, the real killer, behind bars? This is, of course, the Dead Sleep version of events, drawn from a variety of sources, including reading a rather revealing memoir on this murder case, written by one of the suspects, along with a compelling piece by the investigative nonprofit ProPublica. So if you want the full scope of this complicated and contradictory case, check out the links in the show notes. In this sleepy, slow-moving series of events, our story begins in a land with a name that sounds like something out of a fairy tale or a commercial for salad dressing. A place just outside of Aspen, Colorado, called Buttermilk Mountain. Buttermilk Mountain was known as a skier's paradise, a destination for anyone who wanted fresh, powdery snow. But on a Monday morning in February of 2014, a 56-year-old woman named Kathy Carpenter woke up, her stomach sour, her thoughts churning, the all too familiar feelings of guilt and regret. What happened? Kathy did say no. She tried to resist, but Nancy's powers of persuasion, they were just too strong. From the moment Nancy's plane touched down on that Saturday, it was cause for celebration. She was back. Let's break out the good stuff. Pink champagne, Nancy's favorite. And after all, Kathy and Nancy hadn't seen each other in how long? 3 months? They had to make up for lost time. Nancy had a way of putting things in perspective. Kathy was a bank teller. How many brain cells did she need? And while sure, it was probably a fabulous weekend, partying in Fancy Nancy's fabulous Aspen chalet, but in the cold light of the early morning of an even colder February day, Kathy awoke from the sofa in Nancy's living room Nancy's black Labradoodle puppy, Gabe, curled up cozy next to her. Kathy realized. It was now Monday. Back to work. Back on the wagon. Nancy left for her big Australian adventure back in November of 2013, roughly 3 months earlier. But Kathy, she'd been counting the days for a different reason. In Nancy's absence, Kathy decided she'd get sober. She began going to Alcoholics Anonymous. She had a sponsor, Sarah. She was on step 4 when Nancy came back. Step 4 is where a person takes a fearless moral inventory of their lives. Alcohol had long been a problem for Kathy, but once she hit her mid-50s, she just got tired of trying to manage her drinking. Her drinking affected everything. Her job as a bank teller, her relationship with her almost adult son, and her mother. And the whole routine, the drinking, the hangovers, the blackouts, the drama, especially the drama with her longtime friend and drinking buddy, that's Nancy Pfister. Kathy was done with all of it. The problem was, Nancy wasn't done with Kathy. Within hours of being in Nancy's company, Kathy relapsed. Such, it seems, was the price of Nancy's friendship. More than friends, actually. The two sometimes seemed like an old married couple. They'd argue and bicker, especially when they drank. Part of the problem was, Nancy and Kathy, they came from 2 very different backgrounds and led 2 very different lives. Fancy Nancy, she was filthy rich, an heiress whose father owned half of Aspen. She was a trust fund baby who never had to grow up. And even though she was in her late 50s, Nancy was still known as a party girl, a social butterfly, a fixture in this town where she'd lived virtually her whole life. It was hard to imagine Aspen without Nancy Pfister. Whereas Kathy Carpenter, she was practically invisible. She wasn't from Aspen. She grew up in an area known as Down Valley. And the only reason why she could afford to live in Aspen was because of the bank. The same bank that Nancy went to. In fact, it's how they became friends. Years earlier, Nancy walked into the Alpine Bank to open up an account, and she took a look at Kathy and blurted out, "You're fat." To which Kathy responded, not missing a beat, "And you're a bitch." The two laughed, then met up for drinks. Then they were thick as thieves. But now, with a bit of clarity, Kathy had to wonder, were they really friends? Equals? Not really. But it wasn't personal. Nancy had an arrogant and imperious attitude towards everyone. She was, in her own way, Aspen royalty. Back in the 80s, in what was her heyday, she dated Michael Douglas, flirted with Jack Nicholson, clinked shot glasses with Hunter S. Thompson. But she was no snob. Nancy was a bohemian bon vivant who was still best buddies with all the busboys. She welcomed everyone in a town that was often unfriendly to outsiders. It was fair to say Nancy collected people more than she had friends. Kathy was one of the closest people, if not the closest person to her. And Nancy still liked to refer to her as her personal assistant. Kathy did a lot for Nancy, managing her practical affairs. A thankless job. But to be a personal assistant, it presumes one's on a payroll, and Kathy was not. If anything, Kathy's friendship with Nancy cost her money. Years earlier, after a night of drinking and partying, Aspen police busted Nancy, charging her with a DUI. This was a surprise. Nancy and her family, they were friends with all of the police department in Aspen. This guy must have been a rookie. Nancy was behind the wheel of her own Prius, and she blamed Kathy, insisting that Kathy pay the fines, over $2,000, for what was, in truth, Nancy's mistake. Kathy tried to argue, insisting it was Nancy's decision to drive, that Kathy had begged her not to. But in the end, it was no use. If she wanted to maintain the friendship, she'd have to pay. It was strange. For a woman so wealthy, from such a well-known family, Nancy was notoriously stingy. She rarely picked up a check, and she was consumed by money and worried she never had enough of it. And yet, she had this abundance of charm. Something about her just drew people in. But the closer you got, the harder it was to get out. For Kathy, it was now or never. She had to choose. Herself and her sobriety, or this toxic friendship with Nancy. And she'd made the choice. Kathy was choosing herself. Her life. So this was it. That morning when she left Nancy Pfister's house, she was leaving her for good. But Kathy couldn't resist extending Nancy one final courtesy. The night before, Nancy complained of hellish jet lag. She needed her beauty sleep. And so she told Kathy. She needed Kathy to write a note and tape it near the front door. The note should read, "Nancy is sleeping." So it was clear, whoever came by, Nancy was not to be disturbed. Kathy did as she was told, writing a note that read, "Nancy is sleeping," then taping it near the entryway to the chalet. And so with that, she got in her car, headed back down the mountain, determined to never look back. It was going to be so hard. Nancy would be very angry. But Kathy, she needed to stay strong. It was tough love. And in so many words, Kathy would need to tell Nancy clearly and firmly, "Nancy, if you don't change, you're dead to me." But this kind of talk, it was counter to Kathy's nature. She was a sweet, soft-spoken person. She wasn't one to court conflict, at least not when she was sober. She would need some help. Not long after she left Nancy's chalet and got ready for work, she reached out to her new best friend, who also happened to be named Nancy. But she wasn't fancy. This Nancy was nice. And she'd been more of a friend to Kathy in a few months than Nancy Pfister had been to Kathy in 10 years. Fancy Nancy Pfister and nice Nancy Styler, they were complete opposites. And perhaps that's why they were also arch enemies. In a stunningly short amount of time, the two Nancys, they'd come to despise each other, with poor Kathy stuck in the middle. Of course, it didn't start out that way. It never does. When the two Nancys first met, in the fall of 2013, they were both certain they'd be best friends, business partners, and even roommates. In the fall of 2013, nice Nancy and her husband Trey were planning a big life change. The couple, they were empty nesters with one son in college, and they planned to relocate from the suburban life in Denver to embrace the more rustic luxury of Aspen, Colorado. Nice Nancy loved Aspen's combination of fresh mountain air and high-end glamour, the perfect place for the spa she and her husband Trey planned to open. The couple, they'd been married for nearly 30 years. Her husband, Trey, he'd worked as an anesthesiologist at a Colorado hospital until a series of health problems forced him to retire early. Now, after a few years of bad luck, both financial and physical, Nancy and her husband decided to pool their life savings, investing over $100,000 into equipment they needed to open their spa, which they planned to do inside the chalet of Fancy Nancy Pfister. It was karma, Fancy Nancy said when she met the couple. She'd placed a local ad advertising her chalet, available for sublet for 6 months, from November until May. The rent, in Aspen terms, was reasonable, $4,000 a month. And when Nancy met the couple and heard about their business, she was so excited. "You should open it here," she offered. And Nancy and Trey Styler, they were thrilled, never realizing that Fancy Nancy, she made a lot of promises and didn't always come through. Nonetheless, she offered her chalet for them to sublet for 6 months and even threw in a free month. They could move in right away, the month of October, as Nancy prepared for her long trip to Australia, a place where she maybe hoped to relocate for good. For the Stylers, this was a miracle. Nancy and Trey had spent almost all of their money making this happen. And after everything they'd been through, all the sacrifices they'd made, maybe, finally, their luck was about to change. If hanging out with Fancy Nancy was bottles of champagne on a Saturday night, friendship with Nancy number 2, Nancy Styler, it was more like proper afternoon tea, sipped from a porcelain cup and saucer with a raised pinky. Maybe Fancy Nancy had the money, but Nancy Styler, she had the class. And well, class, it was something you just couldn't buy. But if there was one thing Nancy number 1 and Nancy number 2 had in common, it was a shared passion for gardening. But even here, the women approached it differently. Aspen Nancy had a greenhouse on the property that was chock full of a bunch of different plants, all willy-nilly and wild. The other Nancy, she was a world-renowned horticulturist who specialized in the cultivation of one specific species, a plant called the Amazon water lily, also known as the giant water lily. These lilies grow wild in the lush rainforests of South America. And if you come across one, they are impossible to miss. Giant water lilies are indeed massive, magnificent. The lily pads rest on top of the water like giant green platters, with a diameter of roughly 8 feet across, large enough for a crocodile to stretch out on. It's wonderful to think about. A lily pad so large, a human could gently, carefully lie down, sprawl out, and relax. The lily pad rocking ever so gently along the near perfectly placid water. So peaceful, so cozy, so warm, so safe. Then, as the day turns to evening, the magic happens. White blooms of the water lily appear, releasing their sweet fragrance, an intoxicating aroma, a mix of pineapple and butterscotch. It's an alluring scent to a special species of beetle. And once the beetle follows the scent into the flower, the petals close up around that insect, trapping it inside. Then just before dawn, the bloom disappears, sinking under the water just before the first blush of sunrise. But the giant water lily is deceptive. On the surface, it looks delicate and peaceful. But just underneath, the water lily hides a viciousness. On the underside of the giant pads are sharp spikes used for protection and to create space. Once a water lily takes root, it pushes away the competition, expanding to take over any available space, depriving everything else around it from sunlight, from oxygen. Any living being that wants to coexist with a giant water lily is destined for a dark and doomed existence. Hence the giant water lily's other nickname, the tyrant of the deep. And so it was with Nancy Styler and her husband Trey when it came time to move in to the Buttermilk Mountain Chalet. The Stylers brought with them a U-Haul filled with all kinds of furniture and knickknacks that once filled their 4,000 square foot mansion, plus the spa equipment for their brand new business. Fancy Nancy was going to need to make some room, and she wasn't one to share, unless it was her opinion. Fancy Nancy gave Nancy Styler the nickname Martha because she acted like Martha Stewart, which Nancy Styler decided to take as a compliment, however backhanded. That first month, in October, the month they were afforded free to live with Nancy, the Stylers felt less like subletters and more like unpaid help. They were always doing favors and running errands for Nancy. This included taking care of Gabe, the adorable black Labradoodle puppy that Kathy actually helped pick out a few months earlier. And the Stylers were told if there was any issue with Gabe, They could call Kathy. She was practically the co-parent. She'd come right over and take care of the dog. Meanwhile, Fancy Nancy remained untamed. The Tylers were stunned to discover Fancy Nancy roaming around completely naked. Her days usually started around noon, with pink champagne and other cocktails following soon after. She liked to entertain, gentlemen callers especially at night. And the Stylers, for the first time ever, they were happy that they wore hearing aids. They could turn them off at night, and they wouldn't hear a thing. Nancy Styler actually wanted to move out that first month, just renege on the whole agreement, but her husband Trey told her to be patient. Fancy Nancy would be off to Australia, and they'd have the whole place to themselves. Besides, Trey already paid 3 months of rent in advance, $12,000, and they couldn't afford to lose that money. And where else would they go? They were going to make it work. They had no choice. They'd used up all of their savings to make this whole spa gambit in Aspen work. But if they believed that Nancy heading down under was going to alleviate all the tension and frustration, the Stylers were in for a big surprise. True, it was a relief to not have to shield your eyes while Nancy walked through the kitchen naked. But once she was gone, they discovered just how frugal the heiress really was. One day, when they went to take out the trash, they walked over to the nearby ski lodge and tossed the bag into the dumpster, just as Nancy instructed. Only this time, an employee from the ski lodge ran out and yelled at them. What did they think they were doing? This was a private dumpster. When the Stylers asked what they were supposed to do, the employee told them to pay for trash service, just like everybody else. The Stylers were embarrassed and furious. How could it be? A woman worth untold millions was too cheap to pay for trash pickup. There were other annoyances, like a broken water heater, other things that seemed absurd for the rent they were paying. But the couple's biggest energy drain was Gabe, the adorable black Labradoodle puppy. He was only a few months old and needed a lot of care, training, and attention. And the Stylers just didn't have it in them. There was the business, of course, but also Trey's mental and physical decline. There was a time, not too long ago, when Dr. William Trey Styler was at the top of his field. He was a highly regarded, talented, and deeply caring anesthesiologist. His specialty was easing the minds of anxious patients. That's one of the reasons why Nancy fell in love with him in the first place all those years ago. And he and his wife, his soulmate Nancy, they'd traveled the world. The enviable midlife couple who were still madly in love. Someone once described Nancy as resembling the actress Barbara Eden from that old TV show I Dream of Jeannie. And if that were the case, then Trey, he was Larry Hagman, Nancy's very own Major. Only in this marriage, the roles were reversed. Trey was the one who lived to serve his wife. He was willing to do anything to give her the best life, even if it meant taking his own. At the Colorado hospital, years ago, Trey developed a routine. During his shifts, He'd walk at least 3 miles a day. Then, somewhere in his 50s, he suffered a series of foot injuries, hairline fractures at first. The injuries would heal, only for his feet, both feet, to get injured again, just from walking. Trey had high arches. Maybe that was the issue. But at a certain point, his injuries were so painful, he could barely stand on his own 2 feet. After a series of tests, Trey learned he had a rare condition called Charcot-Marie tooth disease, named after the 3 French physicians who first discovered it. Charcot-Marie tooth disease, Nancy and Trey learned, is a constellation of neurological disorders that affect the peripheral nerves that transmit messages between the brain and the body's muscles. As these nerves slowly degenerate, the disease leads to muscle atrophy of the arms and legs, usually beginning with the legs. People with CMT have high arches, as Trey did, which led to those stress fractures in his feet. Nancy and Trey learned, eventually, the condition would shrink Trey's leg muscles, giving his calves the appearance of upside-down champagne bottles. For Fancy Nancy, pink champagne inspired celebration. But for the Stylers, a champagne bottle was just a reminder of this progressive illness. There was no cure for CMT, just treatment. At first, Trey was determined to keep his job at the hospital. He loved his work, and he made a 6-figure salary. Despite his best efforts, he worried his physical condition, especially his muscle weakness around his legs and arms, would put patients at risk. So he resigned. And the Stylers looked at it like early retirement. They bought an RV, determined to turn this setback into an adventure. But their bad luck continued, with legal and financial woes that finally wore Trey down. One night, he told his wife Nancy he was better off dead. He had this old insurance policy from way back in the 1980s, and if anything happened to him, this insurance policy would pay out the death benefit, even in the case of suicide. He had an idea that he could just drive off a cliff, and Nancy, she would get $1 million payout. At first, Nancy thought he was joking, but he wasn't. Trey was more than willing to sacrifice his life if it meant ensuring the financial future of Nancy and their college-age son. Nancy was the optimistic one, and she assured him he was going to be okay. They would get through this, like they always did. His arms were still strong, she had good legs, and together, they'd make the perfect person. And if, in the end, all roads led to disaster, well then, they'd drive off a cliff together, holding hands, Thelma and Louise style. But not yet. They weren't that desperate. They would find success. They would find their people. It was going to happen here in Aspen.
And one of the first and most important people they'd meet was Fancy Nancy's personal assistant, Kathy Carpenter. And the 3 would become good friends, the closest of confidants, and, at least police would claim, co-conspirators in a vicious and vengeful murder plot.